Hi everyone. Tonight we're trading your mattress for a paper-thin futon on a tatami floor. Swapping your thermostat for a charcoal brazier that may or may not still be lit. And packing away your opinions, because in old Japan, keeping those to yourself was basically a survival skill. Welcome to feudal Japan, somewhere in the Edo period, when the whole country was ruled by a shogun, half the men were armed, and everyone else was doing an enormous amount of very polite bowing to avoid finding out the hard way what those swords were for. Before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, and get comfortable, ideally sitting on your heels, because that's the only acceptable way to sit tonight. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to bathe in the same tub as total strangers and consider it perfectly normal? Could you survive a rigid social hierarchy where your haircut basically announced your paycheck? Would you know how to correctly apologize to a samurai for accidentally splashing mud on his very expensive robe? And could you make it through an entire dinner using chopsticks with the quiet dignity of someone who was not, in fact, raised in a barn? And now, congratulations! You've just woken up in a small wooden house in a castle town, somewhere in Japan, sometime in the 1700s. Your knees already hurt from sitting properly. Your neighbours can hear absolutely everything. And somewhere across town, a very serious man with 2 swords is having a very serious day. Welcome to old Japan. Try very hard not to offend anyone. There is no snooze button in old Japan, and there never will be, because your morning is dictated by roosters, temple bells, and the simple, unforgiving fact that daylight is the only lighting system anyone has. You rise early, fold away the futon you slept on directly on the tatami floor, and begin the daily negotiation of getting yourself presentable before the household, the neighbours, and possibly a passing samurai judge you for it. There is no coffee. There is, at best, a modest cup of tea and a stern sense of duty. Waking up gently is a luxury nobody here has invented yet. The house itself creaks awake around you, paper doors sliding on wooden tracks, someone in the next room already sweeping with a straw broom that sounds exactly like rain if rain had somewhere to be. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is simple. A bowl of rice, maybe some miso soup, perhaps a small pickled vegetable if the household is feeling generous. Nobody is arguing about macros. Nobody has heard of macros. You eat quickly, kneeling on the floor, because chairs are a foreign concept and your ankles are about to become intimately, painfully familiar with that fact. The whole neighbourhood wakes in a kind of staggered chorus, shutters opening, water being drawn from the communal well, someone's child already being scolded for something. It's less an alarm clock and more an entire village agreeing, wordlessly, that morning has simply been declared. What strikes you first, though, is the light. Not electric, not gentle, just the sun arriving exactly on schedule with absolutely no snooze functionality whatsoever. Candles and oil lamps exist, but they're expensive, smoky, and mostly reserved for emergencies or the wealthy, So your entire day is structurally built around when the sun is willing to show up. Go to bed with the dark, rise with the light. It's the original circadian rhythm, except nobody's tracking it on a wrist device and nobody's complaining about their sleep score either. Mostly because nobody's heard of a sleep score, and also because there's rice to plant. Ever tried explaining to a modern teenager that mornings used to start, whether you liked it or not, with zero negotiation and zero blackout curtains? This is that, except everyone's teenager, and the negotiation ended several centuries before anyone thought to have it. You splash cold water on your face from a wooden basin, smooth down whatever your hair did overnight, and step outside into a town that is already fully awake, fully working, and fully uninterested in your opinion about how early it is. The blacksmith's already hammering, the fishmonger's already shouting prices. Somewhere, a rooster is deeply personally proud of itself. And here is the quiet, strange comfort buried in all this enforced early rising. Nobody around you is scrolling anything, dreading anything glowing, or lying awake replaying yesterday's conversations. The day simply begins because the sun said so, and everyone, samurai and farmer alike, obeys the same golden alarm clock without a single snooze button between them. It is, in its own exhausting way, wonderfully democratic. The sun does not care about your rank. It rises on merchants and lords with equal, punishing enthusiasm. You'll get used to it. You won't enjoy it, but you'll get used to it. Which in old Japan is more or less the same thing as happiness. Let's talk about the house you just stumbled out of, because it turns out the emptiness inside wasn't an oversight. It was very much the entire plan. Walk into your home and you'll notice something is missing. Basically everything. No chairs, no beds, no clutter, just woven tatami mats, sliding paper doors, and a single low table that appears and disappears depending on what the room needs to be at that exact moment. This isn't minimalism as a trend, it's minimalism as a structural necessity, because the whole house can be rearranged in minutes depending on whether you're sleeping, eating, or hosting your intimidating uncle. You will spend the entire day sitting on the floor, and your knees will file a formal complaint by lunchtime. The tatami mats themselves are woven from rice straw, standardized in size so precisely that the size of a room is actually measured by how many mats fit inside it, which is either the most efficient real estate system ever devised or a very elaborate way of avoiding math. They smell faintly of dried grass, a scent that becomes so familiar you'll stop noticing it within a week, right up until you leave the house and realize the rest of the world smells like absolutely nothing in comparison. The paper doors, called shoji, let in a soft, filtered light during the day and provide precisely zero soundproofing at night, meaning your neighbour's snoring is now, functionally, your snoring too. Furniture, such as it is, gets stored away the second it isn't needed. Your futon, thin and surprisingly comfortable once you stop expecting a mattress, gets folded into a closet each morning, transforming your bedroom into your dining room, into your sitting room, into your bedroom again by nightfall. It's the 17th century equivalent of a studio apartment with excellent multitasking skills and absolutely no privacy whatsoever. Want to redecorate for a guest? Just slide a wall. The wall was never really a wall. It was more of a strong suggestion. Sitting is its own skill and not one you arrive with. The proper position, kneeling with your legs folded beneath you, called seiza, looks serene and dignified right up until the 20-minute mark, at which point your legs stage a quiet rebellion and you start wondering whether dignity was ever really worth this. Locals do it effortlessly, chatting and eating and conducting entire business meetings in this position, while you sit there recalculating every decision that led you to this floor. Ever tried sitting perfectly still on a hard surface for an hour while pretending your legs aren't slowly losing all sensation? Multiply that by every meal, every meeting, every quiet evening of your entire life, and you begin to understand why Japanese furniture design eventually, mercifully, invented the leg-warming table. There's a peaceful logic to all this bareness, though, once you stop fighting it. A room with nothing in it can become anything you need, which is either brilliant interior design philosophy or a very polite way of saying nobody could afford chairs. Either way, the house breathes with you, empties and fills according to the rhythm of the day, asking nothing of you except flexibility, good knees, and a willingness to fold up your entire life every single morning. Which brings us, unavoidably, to the one part of your evening where all that folding and kneeling finally pays off, because it's time to get properly, thoroughly, unapologetically naked in front of your entire neighbourhood. Nothing quite prepares you for your first trip to the Centaur, the neighbourhood bathhouse, where the entire community gathers to soak in the same steaming tub, stark naked, with the emotional ease of people discussing the weather. Modesty, as you understood it, does not exist here. What exists instead is a strict, unspoken code about washing yourself thoroughly before you dare climb into that shared water, because nobody wants to be the stranger who skipped that step. It is communal, it is scalding, and somehow it is also one of the most relaxing things you will ever unwillingly do in public. You enter through a curtain, undress in a small changing area alongside a dozen strangers doing the exact same thing without a flicker of self-consciousness, and grab a small wooden bucket and a low stool. The washing area comes first, always, a strict and sacred rule, because the communal tub is for soaking, not scrubbing, and heaven help the newcomer who tries to reverse that order. You scrub, you rinse, you scrub again, the steam thick enough to fog up whatever composure you walked in with, and only then do you lower yourself into water hot enough to make your ancestors reconsider their life choices. Conversation flows easily in the tub, gossip mostly, the price of rice, someone's terrible son-in-law, all delivered with the casual intimacy of people who have seen each other naked roughly 4,000 times and simply stopped caring. Ever tried making small talk with a stranger while both of you are doing absolutely nothing to hide anything? This is that, except it happens daily, and eventually you stop noticing, which is either character growth or Stockholm Syndrome. And honestly, at this point, does it matter which? The water itself is heated in a great furnace behind the bath, tended by an attendant who keeps the whole operation running, and steam rises off the surface in slow, curling ribbons that catch the low lantern light beautifully, right up until someone's elbow finds your ribs. Privacy screens don't really exist. Personal space is a foreign concept these locals have never needed, and will not be adopting on your account. You will, against every instinct you arrived with, come to genuinely look forward to this. There's something about mandatory, communal, scalding vulnerability that flattens social hierarchy rather efficiently. A samurai and a fishmonger look remarkably similar with their hair wet and their guard down. So you soak, you sweat, you listen to gossip you didn't ask for, and you emerge pink, boneless, and strangely at peace with a level of communal nudity that would have mortified you roughly 2 hours ago. It is, without question, the most honest social equalizer this entire, rigid, hierarchical society has managed to invent. And it required absolutely no legislation whatsoever. Just hot water, thin walls, and a complete abandonment of shame. Now that you're clean, relaxed, and thoroughly humbled, let's talk about the thing every single meal, every tax bill, and every farmer's entire existence quietly revolves around. In old Japan, rice is not just food. It is money, tax, rent, and a running measure of your entire domain's worth, counted in units called koku, that decide how wealthy a lord is considered to be. You will eat it at every meal, watch farmers flood the paddies with back-breaking precision, and slowly realize that the empire runs on grains smaller than your fingernail. Miss a harvest, and it isn't just dinner that suffers, it's the entire regional economy, quietly panicking in the background. A koku, roughly enough rice to feed one adult for a year, becomes the unit by which everything gets measured. A samurai's stipend is paid in koku. A lord's domain is ranked by how many koku of rice it produces annually, which means the entire feudal power structure is, quite literally, built on a foundation of grain. Imagine your salary, your social rank, and your landlord's mood all being calculated in bowls of rice, and you start to understand why the harvest festival carries the emotional weight of a national holiday crossed with a shareholder meeting. The rice itself demands relentless labour, flooded paddies requiring constant management of water levels, careful transplanting of seedlings by hand, weeks of weeding under a sun with absolutely no sympathy. Farmers wade through mud up to their calves, backs bent for hours, a posture that would send a modern physical therapist into a full panic. The smell is earthy, damp, faintly sweet, mixed with the sharper tang of fertilizer that we will, regrettably, discuss again later. Steam rises off the paddies in the early morning, and somewhere a farmer is muttering about the weather with the same weary devotion your grandfather reserved for his lawn. At the table, rice appears in every form imaginable, plain and steamed for daily meals, pressed into cakes for celebrations, fermented into sake for basically every occasion that requires forgetting your problems briefly. It's the entire nutritional and economic backbone of the country, wrapped into something you can hold in a bowl. Miss a harvest to drought or flood, and prices swing wildly. Farmers suffer first and worst, and somewhere a lord is recalculating his entire wealth on the back of a very bad growing season. Ever had your entire paycheck depend on the weather cooperating for exactly the right 6 months? Welcome to everyone's life here, give or take a typhoon. There's something almost poetic in a civilization built so completely around a single crop, though poetic is a word that loses its charm quickly once you're the one ankle-deep in a paddy at dawn. Still, rice ties everyone together. Samurai and farmer, lord and merchant, all of them counting, taxing, eating, and depending on the same small white grain. It is humble, it is exhausting to produce, and it is, without a shred of exaggeration, the single most powerful substance in the entire country, quietly running an empire while asking for absolutely no credit whatsoever. Speaking of people who take themselves very seriously around here, let's talk about the man down the street with 2 swords and an expression that suggests he's already judging your posture. Somewhere in your neighborhood lives a samurai, and you will know him instantly by the 2 swords at his hip and the general air of a man who takes etiquette extremely, extremely seriously. He belongs to the warrior class, sworn to a code of loyalty and honor called Bushido, and he has, at least in theory, the legal right to deal harshly with anyone who disrespects him. In practice, most days involve considerably more paperwork and ceremony than sword fighting, but you're not about to test that theory over a poorly timed joke. Bushido demands loyalty to one's lord, discipline, honor, and a willingness to face death without flinching, which sounds dramatic until you realize most samurai in this era spend far more time as bureaucrats, tax collectors, and household managers than as warriors on any actual battlefield. The wars that once justified their entire existence have quieted considerably, leaving a whole class of trained fighters with excellent posture, sharp swords, and suddenly a great deal of paperwork to fill out instead. It's the historical equivalent of training your entire life for a marathon that keeps getting rescheduled indefinitely. Still, the swords matter enormously, both the long katana and the shorter companion blade, worn constantly, maintained obsessively, treated with a reverence that borders on religious. A samurai does not simply carry a sword, he performs an entire relationship with it, cleaning it with precise ritual, storing it with specific care, drawing it only under very particular circumstances that etiquette manuals spend considerable ink explaining. Brush against one carelessly in a crowded street, and you will discover very quickly exactly how seriously that relationship is taken. Daily life for him involves rising early, likely practicing swordsmanship or martial arts, attending to administrative duties for his lord, and observing a code of conduct so detailed it covers everything from how he addresses superiors to how he's expected to accept an insult without visible anger. Emotional restraint is practically a professional requirement. Ever worked a job where you had to remain perfectly composed, no matter how badly your day was going, all while wearing something sharp enough to end an argument permanently? That's essentially his entire career. His social standing sits at the very top of the official hierarchy, above farmers, artisans, and merchants alike, regardless of how much actual money he has, which, given his often modest stipend paid in rice, might be considerably less than the merchant he's technically allowed to look down on. It's rank built on service and birth rather than wealth, a system that occasionally leaves proud, sword-bearing warriors quietly, awkwardly broke, while merchants beneath them in official status live in considerably nicer houses. So you learn, quickly and thoroughly, to bow appropriately, speak carefully, and never, under any circumstances, splash mud on his robe while hurrying past. It's a small price for peace, and honestly, given the alternative, an extremely reasonable one. He's not looking for trouble. He's looking for the correct amount of respect, delivered promptly and without complaint, which is really all any of us want from our neighbours, just with slightly higher stakes involved. Now that you understand the man next door, let's deal with the daily ordeal of simply putting clothes on your own body. Getting dressed in old Japan is not a 2-minute affair of grabbing whatever's clean. The kimono is layered, wrapped, and tied with a precision that takes years to master, and the exact way you fold it, the colour you choose, and the pattern you wear all quietly announce your class, your age, and sometimes your marital status to anyone paying attention. Sumptuary laws even dictate what fabrics commoners are allowed to wear, because apparently looking too fancy was once considered a genuine threat to public order. You will spend a suspicious amount of time simply being tied into your own outfit. The kimono itself wraps left over right, always, a detail so important that reversing it is reserved exclusively for dressing the dead, meaning one small mistake in the morning could accidentally send a rather unfortunate message to your entire neighbourhood. An obi, a wide, stiff sash, wraps around the waist and gets tied into an elaborate knot at the back, a process requiring either years of practice or, more realistically, a patient family member who's done this every single day of their life and sighs audibly at your fumbling attempts. Fabric and colour carry meaning far beyond aesthetics. Silk, vibrant dyes, and elaborate patterns are largely reserved for samurai and the wealthy, while commoners are legally restricted to plainer materials like cotton or hemp, in muted, sensible colours that won't draw unwanted attention from the authorities. It's fashion policed not by trends but by decree, meaning your outfit isn't just a style choice, it's a small, wearable confession of exactly where you stand in society. Ever had a dress code so strict it wasn't just suggested but legally enforced, down to the exact fabric touching your skin? This is that, except the fashion police carry actual swords. Getting dressed becomes a genuinely physical undertaking, layers upon layers depending on the season, an inner robe, an outer robe, the obi cinched snug enough to remind you it's there with every single breath you take for the rest of the day. In winter, you add padded layers for warmth. In summer, lighter, breathable fabrics that still manage to feel like far too much cloth for the relentless humidity clinging to everything. There is no quick fix here, no throwing on a t-shirt in 30 seconds flat. Every morning demands patience, careful folding, and someone standing slightly behind you adjusting things you cannot see. And once you're finally fully dressed, you move differently. Smaller steps, careful posture, because the tight wrap of the obi and the length of the fabric simply won't allow for anything else. It's clothing that dictates behaviour as much as it reflects status, forcing grace whether you feel graceful or not. By the time you've successfully wrapped, tied, and adjusted your way into presentable society, you've spent more time getting dressed than most modern mornings spend on breakfast, commute, and the first 3 meetings combined, and you haven't even stepped outside yet. Which is, conveniently, exactly where we're headed next, because that outfit you just wrestled into is about to tell an entire town precisely where you rank in a very rigid, very specific pecking order. Society here is neatly divided into 4 official classes. Samurai at the top, followed by farmers, then artisans, then merchants dead last, despite the merchants often being the ones with all the actual money. It's an order based on usefulness to the state rather than wealth, which means a rich merchant technically outranks nobody, no matter how many silk robes he owns. You will quickly learn that where you're born decides almost everything about how you're expected to behave, dress, and speak for the rest of your life. This hierarchy, called Shinoko-sho, ranks people by their perceived contribution to society rather than their bank balance, which is a philosophically tidy idea that gets considerably messier in practice. Farmers rank second, prized in theory for feeding the entire nation, yet living lives of genuine hardship, taxed heavily and tied closely to their land. Artisans, craftsmen producing goods society needs, sit third, respected for their skill but still firmly beneath the farmers who grow the rice everyone depends on. And merchants, despite handling the money that increasingly runs everything, sit officially at the very bottom, because trading goods for profit was considered, at least on paper, less honourable than producing them. The gap between official rank and actual daily reality becomes almost comical the longer you observe it. A farmer might rank higher than a merchant in theory, yet live in genuine poverty, while merchants, unofficially, grow enormously wealthy financing everyone above them, including samurai who often find themselves quietly, embarrassingly in debt to the very merchants they're permitted to look down on. It's a bit like ranking someone above their own boss purely on principle, while their boss quietly owns their house, their car, and possibly their dignity too. Movement between these classes is, for the most part, essentially frozen. Born a farmer, you'll almost certainly die a farmer. Your children after you doing exactly the same. Born a samurai, your position, however financially modest, remains socially untouchable. It's rigid in a way that would send a modern career coach into an existential crisis, an entire life's trajectory decided before you've even learned to walk, let alone developed opinions about what you might have preferred instead. Ever worked somewhere where seniority mattered more than actual skill or results? Where the person who'd simply been there longest or been born into the right family outranked everyone regardless of merit? Multiply that by an entire nation, add legally enforced clothing restrictions, and you've got yourself the social structure of old Japan, humming along for centuries with remarkably little official complaint, mostly because complaining loudly about your assigned rank tends to invite consequences considerably more serious than a stern performance review. And on that thoroughly organised, thoroughly unequal note, let's head to the table. Because it turns out even dinner here comes with centuries of patient, faintly pungent preparation behind it. Long before sushi meant a quick lunch wrapped in plastic, it meant something considerably stranger. Fish packed in salted rice and left to ferment for months, sometimes years, until the rice practically dissolves and you discard it entirely, eating only the preserved fish underneath. It is not a snack. It is a slow, patient, faintly smelly project that your grandmother would have taken very seriously. The fast, fresh version you're picturing right now is centuries away from existing. This method, called narezushi, developed originally as a way to preserve fish without refrigeration, which, given the complete absence of refrigeration anywhere in this century, was less a culinary preference than a genuine survival necessity. Fresh fish is packed tightly with salt and rice, weighted down and left to sit for weeks or months. The natural fermentation process slowly breaking things down into something pungent, sour, and, once you adjust your expectations considerably, genuinely delicious. The smell alone announces itself from another room entirely, sharp and briny in a way that either intrigues you or sends you searching urgently for the nearest exit. Meals more broadly follow a simple, repetitive rhythm. Rice as the constant foundation, supplemented by fish when available, seasonal vegetables, pickles fermented in their own right, and soy-based seasonings that add depth without requiring much beyond patience and time. Meat is rare, largely avoided by much of the population due to Buddhist influence discouraging the consumption of four-legged animals, meaning fish, tofu, and vegetables carry the bulk of the protein workload. Ever tried building an entire cuisine around ingredients that all essentially require you to just wait longer? This is that, and the waiting is, somehow, the whole point. Soy sauce itself takes months to properly ferment, miso paste even longer, both requiring careful monitoring, specific temperatures, and the kind of patience modern fast food culture would find genuinely baffling. Nothing here is instant. Nothing here is convenient. Everything simply requires you to start considerably earlier than you'd like and trust the process. A phrase that would have meant something entirely different and considerably more literal to a household managing 3 separate fermenting projects simultaneously in the back room. And yet, despite the smell, despite the months of waiting, the resulting flavors carry a depth and complexity that instant alternatives simply cannot replicate. A savory richness built entirely on time rather than shortcuts. You develop, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, an appreciation for food that demands this much advance planning. The way you might grudgingly respect someone who's been training for a marathon for an entire year, while you're still deciding whether to walk to the corner store. The fish, when it finally emerges from its long, rice-packed slumber, tastes like patience itself, sharp, sour, and utterly unlike anything sitting in your refrigerator back home. Speaking of things that require patience beyond modern comprehension, let's slow down even further. Because somewhere across town, an entire ceremony is unfolding around the simple, deceptively complicated act of making tea. Somewhere in a small, deliberately plain room, a tea ceremony is unfolding with a level of choreography that would make a military drill look casual. Every movement, from the way the whisk is held to the angle you rotate the cup before drinking, is prescribed, practiced, and steeped in centuries of quiet philosophy about harmony, respect, and simplicity. What looks like making a cup of tea is actually a small, meditative performance, and rushing it is considered a minor act of violence against the entire tradition. The room itself, called a chashitsu, is small, spare, and deliberately unremarkable, often requiring guests to crawl through a low entrance specifically designed to humble everyone equally, samurai and farmer alike forced into the same undignified crouch before they're even allowed inside. Once seated, the host prepares powdered green tea called matcha, with movements so deliberate, so specifically choreographed, that an entire lifetime can be spent studying and still not fully mastering them. The whisk moves in a precise pattern. The bowl gets turned a particular number of times before being offered. Nothing is casual. Nothing is rushed. Guests, for their part, are expected to admire the tea bowl itself, often a specific, sometimes centuries-old piece chosen deliberately for the occasion, commenting appreciatively on its shape, its glaze, its imperfections, because imperfection here is treasured rather than hidden, a philosophy called wabi-sabi that finds genuine beauty in the cracked, the asymmetrical, the quietly imperfect. Ever sat through a meeting where every single gesture felt scripted, deliberate, and vaguely judged? Except this meeting also involves surprisingly bitter tea and total silence. That's roughly the emotional temperature of your first tea ceremony, minus the judgment, which exists here too, just delivered with considerably more grace. The whole event can stretch for hours, incorporating a light meal, careful conversation, and long stretches of comfortable, purposeful silence that would feel unbearably awkward anywhere else, but here simply feels correct. Rushing is, quite genuinely, considered rude, a small act of disrespect toward your host, your fellow guests, and the tea itself, as if the beverage has feelings about being gulped down carelessly. You learn to slow your entire nervous system down to match the room, which, after weeks of hurried mornings and communal bathhouse elbow jabs, feels like a genuinely restorative kind of exhausting. Beneath all the ritual sits real philosophy, the ceremony designed to create a moment of genuine connection and mindfulness between host and guest, stripping away rank and hierarchy for the length of a single shared bowl of tea. For a few quiet minutes, samurai and merchant kneel in the same small room, drinking from the same simple cup, equally humbled by the low doorway and the shared silence. It's remarkably democratic for a society this obsessed with rank, proving that sometimes all it takes to level a rigid hierarchy is a very small room and a very, very slow cup of tea. Now that you've been properly humbled by a beverage, let's get you back on your feet and moving, because there's an entire country to cross, and your feet, regrettably, are the only vehicle available. If you need to travel between cities, you're walking the Tokaido, a long, busy highway lined with checkpoints, inns, and officials who very much want to know who you are and why you're moving around their shogun's territory. There are no cars, no trains, just your own 2 feet, or, if you're wealthy enough, a palanquin carried by exhausted men who did not sign up for your extra luggage. The whole road is dotted with post towns built solely to feed, house, and inspect travellers, because apparently everyone in charge really wanted to know where everyone else was going. The Tokaido stretches for roughly 300 miles, connecting the shogun's capital to the imperial city, and along its length sit 53 official post towns, each one offering inns, food stalls, and checkpoints staffed by officials checking travel papers with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely suspects everyone of something. travel without proper documentation simply isn't an option, particularly for women whose movements are watched with particular suspicion. A policy designed largely to prevent the wives of feudal lords from quietly slipping away from the capital, where the shogun keeps a close, deliberate eye on them. Walking the route takes roughly 2 weeks for the full length, your feet developing blisters that develop their own blisters, your legs aching in ways that make yesterday's tatami-induced knee complaints feel like a minor inconvenience. Wealthier travellers ride in a palanquin, an enclosed box carried on poles by a rotating team of exhausted porters, which sounds luxurious until you consider the constant swaying, the cramped space, and the fact that the men carrying you are, quite reasonably, not thrilled about your decision to pack 3 extra bags. Ever been driven somewhere by someone who was clearly, silently furious about the traffic? Now imagine that furious silence carried on someone's actual shoulders for 11 straight hours. The post towns themselves buzz with a particular chaotic energy. Inns competing loudly for your business, food stalls selling local specialities you've never encountered and will likely never encounter again. Porters and merchants and pilgrims all crossing paths in a controlled, regulated stream of humanity moving in both directions simultaneously. Woodblock prints of the era capture this route obsessively, artists finding endless inspiration in the changing landscapes, the mountains, the rivers, the small dramas of travellers arguing with innkeepers over the price of a room. Checkpoints punctuate the journey at strategic points. Officials inspecting papers, questioning travellers, occasionally confiscating weapons that shouldn't be moving freely through certain territories. It's less a relaxing scenic walk and more a rolling, multi-week security screening, except the screening involves considerably more mountains and considerably fewer plastic bins. By the time you finally arrive at your destination, sunburned, blistered, and thoroughly documented by every checkpoint along the way, you understand precisely why this single road produced centuries of art, poetry, and complaint in roughly equal measure. And speaking of forced, exhausting travel, let's talk about the specific, deliberately punishing version reserved exclusively for the lords who technically outrank you. Every few years, feudal lords across the country are required to leave their home domains and travel in an enormous, expensive procession to the capital, where they must live for a year before heading home again, only to repeat the whole exhausting cycle. It sounds like a scheduling nightmare, because it is one. And that's exactly the point. The shogun designed this system specifically to drain the lord's wealth and keep them too busy travelling to ever organise a rebellion. It's corporate relocation policy, except with more spears. This system, called sankin kotai, requires each of the roughly 250 feudal lords, or daimyo, to alternate residence between their home domain and the shogun's capital. And even when they're permitted to return home, they must leave their wives and heirs behind in the capital, permanently, essentially as very well-dressed hostages, ensuring good behaviour. The processions themselves are enormous, sometimes involving thousands of retainers, servants and soldiers, all moving together in a display of wealth and status so extravagant that the cost alone nearly bankrupts many domains before they've even arrived. Picture the logistics of it. Hundreds of people requiring food, lodging and security across weeks of travel, moving at a pace dictated by the slowest wagon and the most exhausted porter. All so a lord can arrive impressively enough to maintain face among his peers. Ever had to relocate for work? Except the relocation happens every other year indefinitely, costs a genuine fortune, and your family stays behind in the new city permanently as a kind of polite, extremely expensive collateral. That's the daimyo's entire professional existence, dressed up in silk and called an honor. The genius of the system, from the shogun's perspective, lies precisely in its exhausting inefficiency. Lords spend so much of their wealth on these processions, on maintaining two households, on the sheer expense of appearing sufficiently impressive, that few have the resources left over to fund an actual rebellion, even if they were inclined to try one. It's control through logistics rather than force, a bureaucratic leash so effective that it keeps the entire feudal power structure quietly, expensively obedient for over 2 centuries. Along the way, the processions inject genuine economic life into the towns they pass through. Innkeepers, food vendors and merchants, all benefiting from the steady, predictable flow of wealthy travellers requiring food and lodging on a schedule the shogun himself effectively set. The Tokaido you just finished blistering your way across owes much of its bustling infrastructure directly to this system. Entire towns built and sustained by the twice-yearly parade of exhausted, over-scheduled nobility passing through. So the lords travel, the towns profit, the shogun sleeps soundly, and somewhere, in a procession stretching for miles, a daimyo who would very much rather be home is instead calculating, for the 4th time this decade, exactly how much this particular display of loyalty is going to cost him. It's a brilliant system if you're the one running it, and an exhausting one if you're the one, quite literally, footing the bill. Now, let's talk about how you'd recognize any of these people at a single glance, because old Japan solved the name tag problem centuries before anyone thought to invent one. Long before anyone invented name tags, old Japan invented something almost as effective. Hairstyles and clothing so specific that a single glance told you a stranger's class, profession, and marital status. Samurai wear their hair in a particular shaved and knotted style. Married women alter their look in specific, recognizable ways. Even the pattern on someone's sleeve can quietly announce who they are before they've said a single word. It's a full social resume worn directly on the body. The samurai's top knot, called chon mage, involves shaving the top of the head and pulling the remaining hair back into a tight, oiled knot, a style requiring regular maintenance and, frankly, a barber willing to see the same terrifying blade you saw earlier get applied to someone's scalp with total confidence. Married women, meanwhile, often blacken their teeth in a practice called ohaguro, a custom that sounds alarming until you learn it was considered genuinely elegant, a sign of maturity and commitment rather than, as your modern instincts might suggest, a dental emergency. Clothing patterns carry equally specific meaning. Family crests called camon appearing on formal garments to identify lineage, the way a modern business card might, minus the awkward small talk that usually accompanies handing one over. Merchants develop their own subtle signals, quality fabric worn discreetly beneath plainer, legally compliant outer layers, a wink to those who know what to look for, while technically staying within the sumptuary laws that govern who's allowed to look how wealthy. Ever tried to figure out someone's job just from their outfit at a party, only to be completely wrong? Here, you'd actually be right, because the entire system was engineered specifically so you couldn't be wrong. Even posture and walking style carry information. Samurai trained to move with a controlled, deliberate bearing that announces discipline before a single word is exchanged, while farmers and labourers move with the practical, unhurried efficiency of people whose bodies have simply adapted to decades of physical work. You start, almost without realising it, reading the street the way you might read a room back home, sizing up strangers based on cues that would have meant absolutely nothing to you a month ago, and now feel impossible to ignore. This visual shorthand serves the entire rigid social structure beautifully, reinforcing rank and role without requiring a single spoken word. Everyone, instantly, silently categorized the moment they step outside. It's efficient in the way that surveillance is efficient, comprehensive, quietly oppressive, and remarkably effective at keeping everyone exactly where the system intends them to stay. You'll find yourself within weeks doing the same silent calculations about strangers that everyone around you has been doing their entire lives, a skill you never asked to develop, and one you'll be strangely reluctant to lose. Which brings us, appropriately, to a considerably less orderly aspect of this society. Because all that wood and paper you've been living inside has one very significant, very flammable downside. Living in a city built almost entirely of wood and paper has one very obvious downside. It burns spectacularly and often. Fires sweep through crowded districts with terrifying regularity, and earthquakes rattle the whole archipelago on a schedule nobody can predict. Firefighting brigades develop their own proud, competitive culture, racing to tear down buildings before flames can spread to them, because putting the fire out is considerably harder than simply removing its next meal. You will learn to sleep with one eye slightly open. Major cities suffer catastrophic fires with grim regularity. Entire districts reduced to ash within hours. The tightly packed wooden buildings and narrow streets creating perfect conditions for flames to leap from rooftop to rooftop faster than anyone can reasonably respond. Firefighting brigades, called hikeshi, develop a reputation and swagger similar to modern sports teams, competing fiercely with rival brigades over territory and reputation, racing to be first on the scene, not merely out of civic duty, but genuine, fierce pride. Their primary technique involves demolishing buildings in the fire's path rather than dousing flames directly, since water pressure and hoses, as you'd recognize them, simply don't exist yet. The sound alone announces trouble long before you see smoke, alarm bells ringing out across the district. watchtowers stationed specifically to spot fires early and sound the warning. Ever lived somewhere with a genuine, specific fear baked into the architecture, where everyone quietly knows exactly which direction to run and what to grab first? That's daily life here. An entire population maintaining a low hum of preparedness, because the alternative is losing everything to a blaze that started 3 streets over and travelled considerably faster than anyone expected. Earthquakes add their own unpredictable rhythm to all this anxiety. The ground shuddering without warning, buildings swaying in ways that would terrify anyone unfamiliar with the archipelago's particular geological temperament. Locals have developed a strange, weary calm about the whole thing, the same practical shrug your grandparents might have given a thunderstorm, glancing up briefly before returning to whatever they were doing. It's not that nobody's afraid. It's that being afraid constantly simply isn't sustainable. So instead, everyone develops a kind of resigned, functional coexistence with disaster. Firefighters themselves become minor local celebrities, their brigade banners and distinctive coats recognised and respected throughout the district. Children pointing them out with the same excitement modern kids reserve for actual superheroes. And in a strange way, they are exactly that, racing toward danger that everyone else is racing away from, armed with little more than ladders, hooks, and an intense competitive pride in their particular brigade's reputation. So you learn to sleep lightly, keep your most valuable possessions near the door, and never fully relax when the wind picks up on a dry evening. It's a precarious way to live, genuinely, but it's also produced some of the most disciplined, quietly heroic civic institutions in the entire city, all held together by wood, paper, bells, and an entire population's stubborn refusal to be surprised by disaster more than absolutely necessary. Let's move now towards something considerably more glamorous, though be warned, glamorous here comes with its own very specific, very strict rulebook. In the walled-off entertainment district known as the Pleasure Quarters, an entire elaborate economy of art, music, conversation and companionship operates under strict rules and even stricter hierarchies. The most accomplished women here, trained for years in music, dance and witty conversation, hold a kind of celebrity status entirely their own. It is glamorous, tightly regulated, and built on rules so specific they'd make a modern HR department weep with relief that they don't have to enforce them. These districts, walled and gated, operate as their own carefully controlled worlds, entry and exit monitored, the entire area licensed and regulated directly by the shogunate, rather than left to develop informally. Within these walls exists an entire internal hierarchy, the most accomplished and highly trained women, called oiran, sitting at the top, celebrated for their mastery of music, poetry, calligraphy, and conversation as much as anything else, their processions through the district becoming genuine public spectacles that draw crowds simply to watch them walk, elaborately dressed, in specific ceremonial steps. Becoming one of these highly ranked women requires years of rigorous training, beginning often in childhood, lessons in shamisen playing, tea ceremony, poetry, dance, and the specific art of engaging conversation that makes an evening memorable beyond anything physical. It's less a simple transaction and more an entire performance industry built on scarcity, exclusivity, and reputation. An oiran's calendar booked, her attention genuinely difficult to secure, her status something patrons compete fiercely and expensively to attain. Ever tried getting a reservation at a restaurant so exclusive it required knowing someone who knew someone? Now imagine that exclusivity applied to actual human conversation, with years of specific artistic training behind it. The economics of the district are simultaneously glamorous and genuinely difficult. Many young women arriving through circumstances involving family debt or hardship, their contracts binding and often difficult to escape, the elegant surface hiding considerably harder realities underneath. It's important to hold both truths at once here: the genuine artistic accomplishment and celebrity status some women achieved, alongside the constrained, often difficult circumstances that brought many into this world in the first place. The glamour was real. So was the system's underlying coercion, and pretending otherwise would do a disservice to the actual women who lived it. Visitors to the district, meanwhile, follow their own elaborate etiquette. Proper introductions required, reputation and behaviour monitored closely by the house itself. A poorly behaved or disrespectful patron finding himself quietly, permanently unwelcome, regardless of how much money he's willing to spend. It's a world with its own strict social contract. Glamorous surface and rigid rules operating together. An entire economy built on scarcity, performance, and carefully maintained reputation. By evening, lanterns light the district in a warm, golden glow, music drifting from tea houses, laughter and conversation spilling into the narrow streets, the whole area humming with an energy distinctly different from the quiet, orderly town beyond its walls. It's a place built entirely on artifice and performance, yes, but also on genuine artistic mastery that took years to build, existing in a strange, complicated space between celebrated cultural institution and something considerably more difficult underneath the silk robes and careful conversation. Let's step back out through those gates now, away from the lanterns and the silk, and return to the muddy, unglamorous reality most of this country's population actually lives in. Out beyond the city walls, most of the population spends their entire lives ankle-deep in flooded rice paddies, planting, weeding, and harvesting by hand, under a sun that has strong opinions about your comfort. It's grueling, repetitive labour that shapes the entire calendar, the entire economy, and frankly the entire mood of the nation. Farmers are officially ranked second in the social order, right behind the samurai, largely because everyone else, quite reasonably, needs to eat. The farming year moves in a strict, unforgiving rhythm. Seedlings started early in small nursery beds, then transplanted by hand, row by row, into flooded paddies, in a process requiring entire families, and often entire communities, working together, bent double for hours in water that's simultaneously too cold in spring and uncomfortably warm by midsummer. Weeding happens constantly, by hand, no shortcuts available. Every unwanted plant pulled individually from mud that clings to your legs and refuses, quite stubbornly, to let go. Ever done a single hour of yard work and felt genuinely accomplished afterward? Now imagine that same physical labour, every single day, for months, with your entire family's survival depending on getting it exactly right. The harvest itself, when it finally arrives, brings its own frantic urgency. Rice cut by hand with simple sickles, bundled, dried, and threshed before weather or pests can ruin months of careful work. Entire villages coordinate this effort together, a genuine communal undertaking where neighbours help neighbours, not entirely out of pure generosity, but because the harvest simply cannot happen fast enough with any single family working alone. It's cooperation born of necessity rather than sentiment, though the two end up looking remarkably similar from a distance. Taxes, paid directly in rice, take a substantial portion of whatever's grown, calculated by local officials who assess the land's productive capacity with a thoroughness that leaves little room for a farmer to quietly keep a bit extra for himself. A poor harvest doesn't simply mean a leaner year. It can mean genuine hardship, debt, and, in severe cases, famine. The entire household's fate tied directly to weather patterns nobody can control, and soil quality nobody chose. The pressure is constant, invisible, and utterly relentless, hovering over every single growing season like a landlord who never actually announces himself, but is always, somehow, watching. And yet, despite the exhausting labour and constant pressure, there's a genuine rhythm and community built into this life. Festivals timed around planting and harvest, shared meals after long days of communal work, a closeness born from literally standing in the same mud, facing the same weather, depending on the same uncertain outcome together. It's a hard life, genuinely, but not an isolated one. Every family's fortune tangled up with their neighbours in a way that modern remote work culture has, frankly, never quite managed to replicate. So the farmer's work ranks second in official status, while often living considerably harder lives than the merchants ranked beneath them, and the entire country eats, taxes, and survives on the back of their bent shoulders and mud-soaked hands. It's not glamorous, it's rarely comfortable, but it is, without question, the actual foundation everything else in this society is quietly, precariously built upon. Now, let's talk about two enormous men in loincloths, because somewhere nearby, an ancient ritual involving considerable body weight and even more elaborate ceremony is about to begin. Long before it became a spectacle for tourists, sumo wrestling carried genuine religious weight, performed as a ritual to entertain the gods and ensure a good harvest. Two enormous men face off in a small ring, and the entire event is soaked in ceremony, from the salt tossed to purify the ring, to the elaborate rituals performed before a single push actually happens. It is part sport, part prayer, and entirely one of the strangest, most captivating things you will ever watch two large men do to each other. The ring itself, called a dohyo, is built from clay and marked with rice straw bales, considered a genuinely sacred space rather than merely a competitive arena, purified before each match with handfuls of salt thrown by the wrestlers themselves, a gesture meant to cleanse the ring of evil spirits rather than simply look dramatic, though it accomplishes both admirably. Before the actual match, wrestlers perform an elaborate series of stretches and stomps called shiko, lifting each massive leg high and bringing it down with tremendous force. A ritual meant to drive away evil from the ring, and also, quite conveniently, giving spectators ample time to appreciate exactly how much preparation goes into what's often a match, lasting mere seconds. The wrestlers themselves, called rikishi, follow an entire lifestyle built around achieving and maintaining their size. Elaborate diets, specific training regimens, and daily routines dictated by strict tradition within training stables, where younger wrestlers serve senior ones in a hierarchy nearly as rigid as the society outside. Ever watched a sport where the build-up, the ceremony, and the ritual take considerably longer than the actual competition itself? That's sumo, where the pre-match staring, stomping, and salt throwing can stretch on for several minutes before the actual contest resolves itself in roughly 4 seconds of controlled, explosive chaos. The actual match involves 2 wrestlers attempting to force each other out of the ring or down onto the clay, using any of a specific set of permitted techniques: pushing, throwing, tripping, but never punching or kicking. The whole contest a fascinating combination of raw strength and surprisingly delicate technique. Spectators, gathered close around the ring, react with genuine, passionate investment, cheering favoured wrestlers with an intensity that rivals any modern sporting event, despite matches often ending faster than it takes to describe what happened. Beyond the competition itself, sumo carries genuine spiritual significance tied to Shinto beliefs, its origins connected to ancient rituals meant to divine and ensure good harvests. The sport itself considered a kind of prayer performed through physical contest rather than words. This religious weight persists even as sumo grows into genuine popular entertainment, matches drawing enthusiastic crowds who understand, on some level, that they're watching something considerably older and more meaningful than simply 2 large men attempting to shove each other around. So you watch, transfixed despite yourself, as ritual and raw physical force combine into something genuinely mesmerizing. Ancient prayer and modern spectacle overlapping in a small ring of clay and straw. It's sacred. It's absurd. It's over before you've finished settling into your seat, and somehow, despite all of that, you find yourself already looking forward to the next match, salt and all. Having just watched 2 enormous men perform an ancient religious ritual through the medium of shoving, let's talk about something considerably less visible, but equally capable of unsettling you. Because the shadows here are thick with things that may or may not want to hurt you. The countryside and cities alike are absolutely thick with stories of yokai, the mischievous, sometimes terrifying spirits believed to lurk in rivers, forests, and suspiciously dark hallways. Some are harmless tricksters. Some are said to steal children, drown travellers, or curse entire households. Whether or not anyone truly believes it, nobody is quite willing to test it either, which means an awful lot of very sensible adults quietly avoiding certain bridges after dark. These creatures take an almost overwhelming variety of forms: kappa lurking in rivers and ponds, small, reptilian, water-dwelling tricksters believed to drag unwary swimmers under, countered supposedly by the surprisingly specific defense of bowing politely to them, since their peculiar honor code compels them to bow back, spilling the water from the small dish atop their heads that gives them their power. Tengu haunt the mountains, long-nosed, sometimes winged spirits associated with martial arts and mischief in equal measure. Foxes, called kitsune, are believed capable of shape-shifting into beautiful women to deceive unsuspecting travellers, a belief that has, understandably, made many a man in this era considerably more suspicious of unexpectedly charming strangers met on lonely roads. Ever avoided a certain path or building simply because it felt wrong, without any concrete reason you could actually articulate? That instinct, multiplied across an entire population and given specific names, faces, and cautionary tales passed down through generations, is essentially the entire yokai tradition. Parents warn children away from certain rivers, certain forests, certain hours of the evening, not always because they genuinely believe a spirit waits there, but because the story itself serves a practical purpose, keeping children away from dangerous water, discouraging travel through unlit forests at night, teaching caution through fear rather than lengthy explanation. Storytelling sessions become genuine communal events, particularly during summer evenings, when gathering to share increasingly elaborate ghost stories called hyakumonogatari kaidankai, involves lighting 100 candles and extinguishing one after each tale told, the room growing progressively darker and more unsettling as the night wears on, until the final candle is snuffed, and whatever waits in that final darkness is, by tradition, genuinely summoned. It's essentially a horror movie marathon, except the entire audience genuinely isn't certain whether the ending is fictional. Artists and writers capture these creatures obsessively. Woodblock prints depicting elaborate, sometimes genuinely nightmarish creatures, with a level of specific, imaginative detail that suggests considerable collective effort went into terrifying each other as thoroughly as possible. The folklore serves double duty: genuine entertainment wrapped around practical caution, teaching children and adults alike where danger lurks without needing to explain currents, wildlife, or the simple treachery of unlit mountain paths in overly literal terms. So you learn, alongside everyone else, which bridges to avoid, which forests feel wrong after dark, and which unexpectedly charming strangers might warrant a second, more suspicious glance. It's superstition, certainly, but superstition with genuine teeth, shaping behaviour effectively enough that entire communities organise their evenings around avoiding creatures nobody can definitively prove exist. And frankly, given everything else you've encountered so far, you're not about to be the one who tests it. Let's head towards something considerably louder now, because down in the theatre district, an entirely different kind of spectacle awaits. One involving significantly more shouting, drama, and elaborate makeup. Down in the theatre district, kabuki performances draw enormous, rowdy crowds, eager for elaborate costumes, dramatic makeup, and stories full of betrayal, revenge, and doomed romance. The performances are so popular, and occasionally so scandalous, that the shogunate periodically bans certain elements entirely, only for audiences to find a workaround almost immediately. It's the original guilty pleasure blockbuster, complete with government censors sighing heavily in the corner. Kabuki theatre combines music, dance, and dramatic storytelling into performances that stretch for hours. Actors wearing elaborate, exaggerated makeup called kumadori, bold coloured lines painted across the face to instantly communicate a character's nature. Red for heroism and passion, blue or black for villainy and malevolence. The whole visual language readable at a glance, even from the cheapest seats far in the back. Costumes match this same commitment to spectacle. Layers of vibrant fabric, elaborate wigs, dramatic poses called mie, held at key emotional moments. The actor freezing dramatically while the audience erupts in appreciative shouting, calling out the actor's family name in a specific tradition that functions somewhere between applause and personal endorsement. The plays themselves lean heavily into drama, historical tales of loyal samurai and tragic betrayal, domestic stories of doomed lovers and impossible social pressures. Tales that let audiences experience genuine catharsis, watching characters navigate exactly the rigid social expectations everyone in the audience quietly lives under themselves, except with considerably more swordplay and significantly higher stakes. Ever watched a soap opera and found yourself shouting advice at the television, despite knowing perfectly well the characters couldn't hear you? Kabuki audiences do essentially the same thing, except considerably louder, and the actors, close enough to actually hear it, sometimes adjust their performance in the moment based on crowd reaction. The shogunate, for its part, maintains an uneasy, constantly shifting relationship with the whole enterprise, periodically banning women from performing after their involvement was deemed too scandalous, then banning young male actors for similar reasons, once audiences simply redirected their enthusiasm accordingly, eventually settling into an all-male adult performance tradition where specialized actors dedicate entire careers to mastering female roles with a skill and nuance that borders on its own distinct art form. Every restriction seems to simply redirect the audience's enthusiasm rather than diminish it, proving that regulating entertainment is, and apparently always has been, roughly as effective as regulating gossip. Theatre districts themselves buzz with an energy distinctly separate from the rest of the orderly city, food vendors calling out between acts, audiences eating and drinking throughout performances that can run the better part of a day. The whole event functioning as much as a social occasion as a purely artistic one. Regular attendees develop genuine, devoted followings around specific actors, their arrivals and performances discussed and anticipated with the same enthusiasm your modern world reserves for its own celebrated performers, proving that some things about human nature simply refuse to change regardless of century. So you sit, transfixed, shouting along with everyone else at exactly the right dramatic moment, thoroughly entertained by a form of theatre that survived censorship, scandal, and centuries of shifting restriction by simply being too genuinely enjoyable to suppress. It's loud. It's dramatic. It's occasionally scandalous, and it is, without question, one of the most purely entertaining things this entire, rigid, hierarchical society has managed to produce. Now, let's address something considerably less glamorous than kabuki, because eventually, inevitably, you're going to need to use the bathroom, and the system here deserves, at minimum, an honest explanation. Sanitation in old Japan runs on a surprisingly organized, almost industrious system where human waste is collected and sold to farmers as valuable fertilizer rather than simply discarded. It's efficient, it's sustainable, and it is also, without question, an experience your modern nose is not remotely prepared for. Entire businesses exist around collecting this particular resource, proving that where there's a market, someone, somewhere, has already cornered it. The system works with remarkable, almost admirable efficiency, waste collected regularly from households and public facilities by dedicated collectors who transport it to surrounding farmland, where it's used to fertilize the very rice paddies, producing the grain that measures everyone's wealth and pays everyone's taxes. It's a closed, sustainable loop, genuinely, nothing wasted, everything eventually returning to feed the crops that feed the city, an environmental efficiency that modern sustainability consultants would likely praise enthusiastically in a presentation, right up until they had to personally participate in the actual collection process. Different neighborhoods and even different social classes produce waste considered to have different fertilizing value, a fact that leads to actual competition among collectors for access to wealthier households, whose diets, richer and more varied, are believed to produce superior fertilizer. Ever imagined your household waste having a market value that fluctuated based on your income? It's a genuinely strange thing to sit with, the idea that even this most private, humble bodily function carries economic weight, quietly priced and traded like any other commodity. Public facilities exist throughout cities and along travel routes, simple wooden structures offering considerably less privacy and considerably more smell than anything you're accustomed to. Travelers along the Tokaido depending on these facilities during their long journeys between checkpoints. The collectors themselves, performing genuinely essential if thoroughly unglamorous work, become fixtures of daily city life. Their carts and calls as familiar a part of the urban soundscape as the fishmonger's shouting or the temple bell's morning wake-up call. The smell, predictably, announces itself well before you see anything. A sharp, unmistakable presence woven permanently into the city's broader sensory experience, mixing with wood smoke, fermenting soy, and communal bathhouse steam into an olfactory landscape entirely unlike anything your modern nose has ever encountered. You adjust, slowly, the way you adjust to any persistent smell, noticing it intensely at first, and gradually, reluctantly, developing something resembling tolerance, though never quite genuine enjoyment. There's something almost admirable, once you push past the initial olfactory horror, in a system this thoroughly integrated, waste becoming resource rather than simply refuse, an entire economic chain built around a bodily function most modern societies prefer not discussing at all, let alone building entire trade networks around. It's not glamorous. It will never be glamorous. But it is, in its own thoroughly unpleasant way, a genuinely impressive piece of civic engineering, holding an entire city's agricultural economy together, one careful collection at a time. Let's cleanse our palate, quite literally, with something considerably more beautiful. Because it's that time of year when the entire country stops what it's doing to admire flowers that are actively, deliberately dying. Once a year, the cherry trees erupt into a brief, spectacular bloom, and the entire country seems to collectively drop what it's doing to sit beneath them, eat, drink, and quietly reflect on the fleeting nature of life. It lasts barely a week before the petals scatter, which is, appropriately, exactly the point. Nowhere else will you find an entire culture organizing a national mood swing around a flower's incredibly short attention span. This tradition, called hanami, transforms parks and temple grounds across the country into gathering spaces where samurai and farmers, merchants and artisans, all spread mats beneath the same blossoming branches, sharing food and sake in a rare moment where the rigid social hierarchy softens, just slightly, under the shared, temporary spell of pink and white petals drifting down in the spring breeze. Poets compose verses specifically inspired by the blossoms, the brief bloom serving as a constant, gentle metaphor for the fleeting nature of beauty, youth, and existence itself, a concept called mono-no-aware that appears throughout the culture's art and philosophy. The blossoms themselves last only a handful of days, opening in a sudden, overwhelming rush of colour before wind and rain send petals scattering across the ground in a kind of soft, pink snowfall that somehow manages to feel simultaneously joyful and quietly melancholic. Ever tried explaining to someone why you're genuinely moved by something you know is about to end almost immediately? That's the entire emotional architecture of this tradition, beauty made more precious specifically because it refuses to last. Beneath the trees, the actual celebration involves considerably less philosophical reflection than you might expect, and considerably more eating, drinking, and boisterous socializing. Families and groups of friends gathering on blankets, sharing rice cakes and sake, the whole scene closer to a lively picnic than a solemn meditation on mortality. Children run between the trees while their parents drink slightly too much rice wine and recite poetry with steadily decreasing accuracy as the afternoon wears on, proving that even the most philosophically weighted tradition eventually gives way to simple, universal human enjoyment of a nice day outdoors with good company and better snacks. Temples and gardens compete, quietly, for the reputation of having the most beautiful blossoming trees, certain locations becoming genuinely famous destinations, travelers planning entire trips specifically to arrive during the brief bloom, timing that requires considerable luck given how weather-dependent and unpredictable the exact blooming period tends to be each year. Getting the timing wrong means arriving to bare branches or scattered petals, rather than the peak bloom. A genuinely disappointing outcome after weeks of anticipation, though the disappointment itself, arguably, fits rather neatly into the whole philosophy of appreciating fleeting, uncertain beauty. So you sit beneath the trees, petals occasionally drifting down into your rice wine, surrounded by strangers momentarily equal beneath the same blossoms. And you understand, perhaps for the first time since arriving here, why an entire culture would organize itself so completely around something guaranteed to disappear within the week. It's beautiful precisely because it's temporary, a lesson this whole rigid, hierarchical, exhausting society seems to have collectively decided to relearn every single spring, whether it wants to or not. Now, let's return to something considerably sharper than flower petals, because it's time to properly address the very specific etiquette surrounding the blade every samurai carries, and the very specific consequences of getting that etiquette wrong. A samurai's sword is not merely a weapon, it's a legal symbol, a spiritual object, and a status marker all folded into one terrifyingly sharp package. There are precise rules about how it's worn, how it's handled, and who is even permitted to carry one at all. Handle someone else's sword incorrectly, or worse, brush against it carelessly in a crowded street, and you may find yourself apologizing very quickly and very sincerely. The right to carry two swords, the long katana and shorter companion wakizashi, belongs exclusively to the samurai class, a privilege enshrined legally and enforced strictly, meaning the mere sight of these paired blades at someone's hip announces their rank instantly and unmistakably to everyone on the street. Carrying them isn't casual either. Specific rules governing which side they're worn on, how they're positioned when sitting, and the exact etiquette required when entering someone else's home. swords typically removed and placed with careful, specific respect, rather than simply tossed aside like an umbrella. The blade itself is treated with something approaching genuine reverence, cleaned and maintained according to specific ritual, wrapped and stored with particular care, sometimes passed down through generations as a family treasure carrying as much symbolic weight as practical function. Drawing the sword is never casual either, an entire etiquette governing when and how it's appropriate. Unnecessary or careless drawing considered a serious breach of conduct, regardless of whether the blade ever actually makes contact with anything. Ever accidentally bumped into someone carrying something extremely fragile and expensive and felt your entire nervous system light up with immediate, genuine panic? Now imagine that same fragile, expensive object is also legally permitted to end your life, and you begin to understand the particular tension of navigating crowded streets in a city where roughly 1/10 of the population is walking around armed with a very sharp, very legally protected reason to take offense. The legal concept called kirisute gomen technically permits a samurai to cut down a commoner who has seriously insulted or disrespected him, though in practice, this right is exercised far less frequently than the mere existence of the law might suggest. Most disputes resolved through considerably less lethal means, mostly because using the privilege carelessly or without genuine justification carries serious consequences for the samurai himself, who would need to answer to his own superiors for the decision. Still, the theoretical possibility hangs over every interaction, a quiet, persistent incentive toward exceptionally careful manners whenever swords are anywhere nearby. Merchants and commoners, forbidden from carrying such weapons themselves, develop their own careful, practiced deference around anyone armed, stepping aside promptly, bowing appropriately, generally ensuring their body language communicates respect before a single word gets exchanged. It's a system that keeps the peace largely through pure, well-founded anxiety rather than genuine goodwill, though after enough repetition, the anxious deference starts to feel less like fear and more like simple, practical good manners, indistinguishable, eventually, from the real thing. Given how carefully everyone navigates around these blades, it's worth understanding how the people carrying them manage to become so quietly, remarkably wealthy, despite officially ranking beneath everyone selling them goods. Which brings us neatly to the merchants you've been not quite outranking this entire time. Despite sitting at the very bottom of the official class system, merchants often end up quietly, enormously wealthy, financing samurai debts and controlling entire supply chains from the shadows. They can't outrank anyone on paper, so instead, they simply outspend them, building beautiful homes just modest enough to avoid trouble, while dressing plainly on the outside and lavishly underneath their sleeves. It's the original loophole economy, and everyone politely pretends not to notice. Merchants control the actual movement of goods throughout the country: rice, silk, sake, and virtually everything else passing through their hands at some point between producer and consumer. A position that grants them enormous practical influence, regardless of their official social standing at the very bottom of the hierarchy. Many samurai, their fixed rice stipends increasingly insufficient against rising costs in a growing urban economy, find themselves quietly borrowing from these same merchants, creating a genuinely awkward dynamic where the officially superior class depends financially on the officially inferior one. A tension everyone involved seems to navigate through very careful, very deliberate politeness. The sumptuary laws restricting merchants from displaying obvious wealth, banning silk, banning bright colours, banning ostentatious homes, get worked around with a level of creativity that would impress any modern tax attorney. A merchant's house might present a plain, legally compliant wooden facade to the street, while containing genuinely luxurious interiors, fine lacquerware, imported goods, and craftsmanship completely invisible from outside. His outer robe might be simple, sanctioned cotton, while the inner lining, visible only briefly and only to those he chooses to show, is the finest silk money can buy. Ever known someone who drove a deliberately unremarkable car, specifically to avoid announcing their actual wealth? This is exactly that instinct, just codified into actual law centuries earlier. Merchant guilds develop considerable organizational power, coordinating prices, controlling trade routes, and occasionally exercising influence that rivals official government authority in specific industries, all while their members are legally required to maintain the outward appearance of humble, unremarkable tradesmen. It's a genuinely strange dynamic to witness directly, watching someone bow with elaborate deference to a samurai who owes him considerable money, both parties fully aware of the actual balance of power, both maintaining the fiction with absolutely straight faces. This quiet accumulation of wealth eventually funds considerable cultural development too, merchants becoming patrons of kabuki theatre, of woodblock printing, of the very entertainment districts discussed earlier, their money shaping culture even as their official status remains fixed at society's bottom rung. Its influence purchased rather than inherited, wielded carefully and discreetly, but wielded nonetheless, proving that money finds a way to matter, regardless of what the official rule book claims about where it ranks. So the merchants smile, bow appropriately, dress plainly on the surface, and quietly run considerably more of the actual economy than their official rank would ever suggest. It's a masterclass in working within a rigid system rather than against it, outmaneuvering rank with pure accumulated capital, a lesson in patience and discretion that, frankly, several modern industries could stand to learn from directly. After all that careful financial maneuvering, let's give everyone, merchants and samurai alike, a genuine break. Because there's a particular kind of steaming, mineral-rich relaxation waiting in the mountains that asks absolutely nothing of your social rank. Scattered across the mountainous countryside, natural hot springs called onsen offer weary travellers a chance to soak in mineral-rich water surrounded by steam, silence, and the occasional curious monkey. Entire small towns grow up around a single spring, and visiting one becomes less a vacation and more a quiet act of national therapy. It's proof that long before spa culture had a name, someone had already perfected doing absolutely nothing extremely well. These natural springs, heated by the volcanic activity running beneath the archipelago's mountainous spine, emerge in remote, often stunning locations, steam rising visibly against cold mountain air, the mineral-rich water believed to carry genuine medicinal properties for everything from sore muscles to skin ailments to simple, general exhaustion. Small inns called ryokan cluster around particularly notable springs, offering travellers a place to rest, eat, and soak after long, difficult journeys along routes considerably rougher than the well-maintained Tokaido you walked earlier. The etiquette here mirrors the communal bathhouse you already survived, thorough washing required before entering the shared spring water, modesty largely abandoned in favour of practical communal relaxation. What differs is the setting itself. Natural rock formations rather than wooden tubs, open sky rather than a steamy indoor ceiling, the whole experience feeling considerably more like communing with the actual landscape than simply washing yourself in public. Snow occasionally falls around the steaming water in winter, creating a scene striking enough that even travellers thoroughly exhausted from weeks of walking find themselves briefly, genuinely moved. Ever finally arrived somewhere after an exhausting journey and felt every accumulated ache simply dissolve the moment you stopped moving? That relief, amplified considerably by genuinely hot, mineral-rich water, and absolutely nothing left to do except sit there, defines the entire onsen experience. Travellers along mountain routes specifically plan their journeys around known springs, the promise of a proper soak functioning as motivation through otherwise brutal stretches of walking, much the way a modern hiker might fixate on the promise of a hot shower at the end of a long trail. Local wildlife occasionally joins the scene uninvited, particularly in certain mountain regions where monkeys have discovered these same warm springs offer excellent relief from harsh winter cold, creating the genuinely surreal experience of soaking alongside creatures who seem entirely unbothered by human company and considerably more relaxed about the whole arrangement than you currently are. Nobody quite knows who started this particular tradition among the local monkey population, though everyone seems to agree it's considerably easier to accept once you're already fully submerged and disinclined to argue about shared bathing space with anyone, human or otherwise. Beyond simple relaxation, these springs carry genuine cultural weight, associated with purification in Shinto tradition, a physical cleansing that carries spiritual overtones beyond mere hygiene. Entire pilgrimage routes incorporate specific springs along their path, travellers combining religious devotion with genuine physical relief in a combination that feels remarkably practical for a tradition this old. So you sink into the steaming water, surrounded by mountains, occasionally a monkey, and absolutely no expectation that you accomplish anything whatsoever for the next hour. And you understand, finally, completely, why an entire culture built such reverence around doing precisely nothing quite this well. Let's carry that relaxed, unhurried feeling straight into something considerably louder, because somewhere down in town, an entire community is about to turn its ordinarily quiet streets thoroughly, joyfully upside down. Throughout the year, local festivals called matsuri transform quiet towns into loud, colourful spectacles of lantern-lit parades, portable shrines carried on shoulders, and food stalls selling things that smell significantly better than they probably should. It is part religious ritual, part community party, and part excuse for everyone to briefly ignore the rigid social order and just have a very good time. Somewhere in the crowd, a very serious official is very visibly letting his hair down. These festivals, tied closely to Shinto shrines and seasonal cycles, mark planting, harvest, and various religious observances throughout the calendar year, transforming what might otherwise be a quiet, orderly town into something considerably closer to organised chaos for the duration of the celebration. portable shrines called mikoshi, elaborately decorated and genuinely heavy, get hoisted onto the shoulders of enthusiastic young men who carry them through the streets with a specific, bouncing, chanting rhythm, believed to please and energize the local deity temporarily housed within. The streets themselves fill with vendors selling grilled foods, sweets, and various local specialities, the smoke and smell mixing together into something genuinely appealing, despite, or perhaps because of, its complete lack of refinement compared to the careful, precise cuisine you've encountered elsewhere. Ever attended a genuinely good neighborhood street fair, where the food is slightly questionable, but somehow exactly what the occasion demands? That's the entire culinary philosophy of festival food here. Refined precision deliberately abandoned in favor of exactly the kind of messy, delicious indulgence a proper celebration requires. Lanterns line the streets as evening falls, their warm glow illuminating dancers, musicians, and crowds moving together in a controlled, joyful chaos that feels genuinely different from the careful, hierarchical order governing ordinary daily life. For these few hours, the strict social boundaries soften considerably. Samurai and merchant, farmer and artisan, all pressed together in the same crowded street, laughing at the same performances, eating from the same food stalls, briefly united by simple, shared celebration, rather than divided by rank. Traditional dances called bon odori draw entire communities into simple, repeated movements performed in large circles, the steps easy enough for elderly grandparents and small children alike to join without embarrassment, the whole event functioning as genuine communal bonding, disguised as simple dance. Musicians play taiko drums with an energy and precision that carries across the entire festival grounds, the deep, rhythmic pounding becoming the actual heartbeat around which everything else, the food, the dancing, the shrine parade, organizes itself. These celebrations carry genuine spiritual purpose beneath all the joyful chaos, honoring local deities, marking important agricultural transitions, maintaining the community's ongoing relationship with the spiritual forces believed to influence everything from harvest success to protection against fire and disaster. But the spiritual purpose and the simple human joy of celebration exist together comfortably, neither one cancelling out the other. Proof that ritual and genuine fun have never actually needed to be mutually exclusive. So you find yourself, lantern light flickering across your face, swept along in a dance you're clumsily learning alongside strangers who've done these same steps their entire lives. And for a few genuinely wonderful hours, rank and hierarchy simply stop mattering quite as much as usual. It's loud, it's messy, it smells faintly of grilled everything, and it might be the single most purely joyful thing this entire rigid society allows itself. Let's close out with something considerably more guarded, though, because for all the openness of the festival streets, this entire country keeps its actual front door very deliberately, very carefully shut to the outside world. For most of this era, Japan operates under a policy of strict isolation, allowing only a handful of foreign traders limited, closely watched access through a single controlled port. Curiosity about the outside world exists, quietly, carefully, among scholars and officials, but the shogunate keeps a tight, deliberate grip on who gets in and what gets out. It is a country choosing, very deliberately, to close its own front door. And it will take considerable time and considerable pressure before that door swings back open. This policy, called sakoku, restricts foreign trade and travel almost entirely. Japanese citizens forbidden from leaving the country under penalty of death. Foreign ships largely turned away from every port except one carefully controlled exception. A small artificial island where a limited number of Dutch traders are permitted to conduct business under strict, constant supervision. This single narrow channel becomes the country's only reliable window into outside developments. Dutch ships bringing not just goods, but genuinely valuable information about science, medicine and technology, developing in a world the rest of the country is otherwise entirely cut off from. Scholars dedicated to studying this limited flow of foreign knowledge, called rangaku, or Dutch learning, pursue genuine intellectual curiosity within considerable constraints. Translating medical texts, studying astronomical observations, and absorbing whatever fragments of outside science manage to filter through this single, carefully guarded channel. It's a bit like being allowed exactly one very specific, very monitored internet connection to the entire rest of the world and having to build your entire understanding of foreign progress from whatever trickles through that single narrow pipe. Ever felt genuinely curious about something you were specifically forbidden from investigating further? That particular tension defines much of the intellectual life happening quietly among scholars and officials during this era. Genuine hunger for outside knowledge existing alongside strict, enforced boundaries about how much of it anyone's actually permitted to pursue. The policy stems largely from genuine anxiety about foreign influence, particularly religious conversion efforts that the shogunate views as a direct threat to social stability and political control. Christianity specifically banned and actively suppressed following earlier periods of considerable missionary activity. The isolation isn't total silence, exactly, but it is a carefully managed trickle. Foreign books heavily censored, foreign visitors restricted to that single controlled location, foreign ideas filtering in slowly enough that the shogunate maintains reasonable confidence it can control the pace and scope of outside influence indefinitely. Merchants and officials involved in the limited foreign trade become genuinely valuable sources of information themselves, their occasional reports on outside developments carrying weight and interest well beyond their modest official status might otherwise suggest. This carefully maintained isolation persists for well over 2 centuries, an entire country choosing deliberate insularity over the uncertainty and disruption that greater foreign contact might bring. A choice that preserves considerable cultural distinctiveness while also, inevitably, leaving the country increasingly behind in certain technological and military developments happening rapidly elsewhere in the world. Eventually, considerable external pressure will force this door open again, though that particular chapter belongs to a period considerably beyond where our own visit here concludes. So you leave this quiet, carefully guarded corner of the world, understanding, finally, just how deliberately closed and how genuinely curious it manages to be simultaneously. A country holding its door shut with one hand, while quietly, persistently peering through the smallest possible crack with the other, waiting, whether it fully realizes it yet or not, for a world it cannot keep out forever. So, here you are, at the very end of it, having survived the bell, the bath, the mud, the swords, and an entire class system that decided your worth before you'd taken a single breath. You've bowed to a samurai, gossiped in a scalding tub full of strangers, waited months for a fish to become dinner, and sat through a cup of tea slow enough to qualify as its own small act of meditation. You've walked a road built to exhaust you, watched a lord's entire fortune drain away in the name of loyalty, and learned to read a stranger's whole life from a haircut and a hemline. It was rigid, and it was ridiculous, and somehow, threaded through all of it, it was also genuinely beautiful. That's the part worth sitting with tonight. Beneath the etiquette and the rank and the relentless, unblinking hierarchy, there was real tenderness here. Neighbours carrying a shrine together through lantern-lit streets. Strangers made briefly, wonderfully equal beneath a week's worth of falling cherry blossoms. A whole culture that looked at something as simple as a cup of tea and decided it deserved 4 unhurried hours and your full, quiet attention. People everywhere, it turns out, find their own particular way of building meaning out of mud, rice, and time. So, tonight, as you sink into your own soft bed, with your own working plumbing and your own blessed absence of a topknot, maybe send a quiet thought toward the farmers who fed an empire from the mud, and the fishmongers who shouted their way through every dawn, and the quiet, dignified stubbornness of a place that closed its own front door and somehow still let curiosity in through the cracks. Because life anywhere, in any century, is mostly just people doing their best with the rules they were handed. Sleep well. You've earned the quiet, and unlike everyone you just left behind, nobody's watching you get it.